Halloween had always been a time of light, laughter, and sweet indulgence for most people. But for Tim and Michelle, this year's holiday marked something different, a return to the woods of their childhood, to the place where their parents had once brought them to explore, to laugh, to grow closer to nature. Now, decades later, the siblings were adults. Tim, 40, tall, muscular, calm, a quiet pillar of his small suburban life. Michelle, 35, small, sharp-tongued, loud, and opinionated, a city dweller who often clashed with neighbors. They arrived at the forest on the first morning of winter. Their backpacks modest but sufficient. Water bottles, a few sandwiches, a compass, a tent, and blankets. The plan was simple. They would spend a week in the woods, recalling memories and reconnecting. From the start, the forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows longer. Not a single bird sang, and no squirrel chattered in the underbrush. Tim, ever patient and observant, dismissed it as the season. Early winter kept hikers and animals alike at bay. Michelle, however, was quick to complain. "Seriously, Tim," she said, stamping a booted foot on the frozen leaves. "It's quiet." "Too quiet." Tim smiled faintly, adjusting the straps of his backpack. "Quiet doesn't mean danger. Remember, when we were kids, we used to run through these woods without care." "Nothing ever happened," Michelle rolled her eyes. "Well, maybe because we were too small to notice." By midday, they had set up their camp near a clearing where their parents once pitched tents. Tim unpacked the supplies carefully, laying blankets neatly and arranging the food. Michelle, impatient, complained about the cold and the lack of cell reception. Yet, as evening descended and the last light dipped below the treetops, they gathered around the fire, sharing old stories of childhood mischief. The first night passed uneventfully. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the trees, and the two siblings eventually fell asleep under their blankets, the scent of pine and frost filling their nostrils. The woods did not rest as Tim and Michelle slept. Sometime after midnight, when the fire had dwindled to a bed of faint, crackling embers, the forest began to breathe. Not with wind, no, the air was still, sharp with the bite of early winter. It was something subtler, something older. The trees, tall and looming, seemed to lean imperceptibly closer to the siblings' tent. Their trunks stretched as though with aching patience, their branches crooking and curling, as though desperate to peer inside. On the forest floor, the frozen leaves stirred, though no breeze touched them. They shifted and scraped against each other, sliding across the hard ground like pale insects crawling over stone. They gathered with strange intent. Spirals, circles, even crude figures with arms outstretched, like stickmen reaching for something just beyond their grasp. And then, just as quickly, they shuddered, scattering apart into the stillness once more, leaving nothing but silence. Silence deeper than before. From beneath the earth came a sound. A hum, soft yet steady. It rose like a buried heartbeat pulsing through the soil. The ground itself quivered, once subtle, almost delicate, just enough to rattle the tent pegs. Neither Tim nor Michelle stirred. Their sleep remained heavy, oblivious. Near the fire pit, the earth split open, a hairline crack forming in the frozen ground. From that thin seam came a glow, orange and flickering, as though something alive burned deep below. The light pulsed once, faintly, then vanished as the crack sealed itself, the soil knitting together until it was as though nothing had ever happened. But the forest was not finished. All through the long night, shadows moved between the trees, yet no light existed to cast them. They slid and swayed unnaturally, stretching themselves into elongated forms, their limbs too long, their shapes too thin. They drifted closer until they stood only a breath away from the fabric of the siblings' tent. There they leaned in, their crooked outlines stilling, their heads cocked at unnatural angles, listening to the slow, steady breaths of the two who slept inside. Michelle stirred once, muttering a sound half a word, half a sigh. Instantly, every shadow froze. For a long, terrible moment, they held their places, silent, motionless. And then, with a kind of grudging patience, they melted back into the trees, dissolving into the dark. By the time dawn crept across the clearing, the forest had restored itself to perfect stillness. The air smelled of frost and pine. The light seemed gentle and forgiving. Tim awoke first. He stretched, rubbing at his eyes, convinced the night had been uneventful, peaceful even. Michelle followed, yawning loudly and cursing the cold. Neither of them mentioned dreams, but each carried a faint, stubborn sense that they had not been alone, that something had stood close, watching. The second day began with unease. It was Tim who noticed it first. As he sorted through his pack, his brow furrowed. His compass was gone? So was his spare flashlight? "Michelle," he called, his voice edged with irritation. He held up the empty pockets for her to see. "My compass and my flashlight, they're gone." Michelle, brushing her tangled hair back from her face, only snorted. "Tim, you're overreacting. You're emotionally drained, that's all. Maybe what you need is a girlfriend or a real vacation. Not this woods therapy nonsense." Tim frowned, his lips pressing together. He didn't reply. Instead, he began retracing their steps around the clearing, scanning the frozen leaves, the underbrush, the places where gear could have rolled or been misplaced. But nothing appeared. No compass, no flashlight, not even footprints but their own. The woods were still, too still. The silence pressed against his ears like a weight. The shadows beneath the trees seemed longer than they should have been, stretching across the ground in strange, bending angles. Every faint rustle of leaves made his heart leap, though he forced his face to remain calm. Michelle noticed his expression and, as always, teased him. "You're scaring yourself, Tim. Maybe you just miss the comforts of home, or maybe—" Her grin sharp, playful, "Maybe you need me to babysit you." Tim smiled faintly at that, though the smile was forced. It was easier to let her words wash over him, easier to pretend he wasn't shaken. But inside, a knot of dread had begun to grow. It settled deep in his stomach, heavy and undeniable. Something in the woods was wrong, deeply wrong. Though he did not yet know what. And the forest? The forest gave them no reason to suspect. Not yet. By the third day, unease escalated into genuine fear. Michelle had gone to brush her hair near a tree when Tim noticed something glinting in the sunlight. He stepped closer. There, wedged into the bark of an old oak, was Michelle's hairbrush. It was hers, there was no doubt, but the sight was made grotesque by the crimson streaks dripping slowly down the bark. Michelle gasped, stumbling back. "That's mine." "Tim, 40 years old, what happened?" Tim's calm facade faltered. "It wasn't here yesterday," he said softly. "Something is out here with us. I don't know what, but it's watching." Michelle swallowed hard, her bravado slipping. For the first time, the fearless city dweller looked small, terrified, and wholly dependent on her brother. They retrieved the hairbrush cautiously, but the forest around them seemed to close in. Shadows pooled deeper between trees, and the air grew colder. Each snap of a branch sounded like a footstep. Each rustle in the leaves sounded like a whisper calling their names. Yet they pressed on, determined to continue their trip. They could not leave, not yet. That night, the woods revealed themselves further. Tim and Michelle sat by their small fire, huddled under blankets, trying to convince themselves the world was normal. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, like the wind brushing through the pines, then louder, circling their camp. The fourth day dawned pale and brittle, the light weak through a gauze of thin clouds. Tim rose first, stiff from a night of half-sleep, every nerve still on edge from the whispers that had circled their camp. Michelle stirred reluctantly, her hair tangled, her face drawn with exhaustion. She didn't speak her first complaint like she usually did. That, more than anything, unsettled Tim. They moved slowly, forcing themselves to eat the last of the sandwiches, though neither had much appetite. The forest seemed to watch as they chewed in silence. Every bird remained absent, every branch still. The woods weren't empty, they were waiting. By midday, Michelle tried to distract herself by tidying their supplies. She laid out the blankets, smoothed her coat, brushed the dirt from her boots. That was when Tim noticed another wrongness. Her coat, the inside lining, had been stitched with new thread. A rough, dark thread, clumsy and jagged. It wasn't there yesterday. He reached out, touching the seams with a shaking finger. "Michelle, did you do this?" She glanced down, frowning. "Do what?" The stitches seemed to crawl the longer he stared at them, as though the thread had been forced through in haste, as though someone or something had worked on the garment while they slept. Michelle's face went pale. She shook her head. No, I didn't. They said nothing more but folded the coat in silence. The forest loomed larger with each passing hour, the trees knitting themselves into a tighter wall around the clearing. By afternoon, Tim tried to keep his composure, pacing, retracing steps, pretending to search for a trail. But each turn brought them back to the same hollow, the same fire pit, the same shadows pooling in the same crooked places. It was Michelle who broke first. Tim, I can't do this anymore. We're going in circles, it's playing with us. Her voice cracked, and for once, Tim had no easy reassurance. He only nodded, staring into the forest with a clenched jaw. When night came, they lit the fire earlier than usual, gathering close to its warmth as if it were the last defense they had. The light flickered weakly, and every gust of air threatened to snuff it out. At first, the woods remained still, too still, and for a few minutes they almost believed nothing would happen. Then came the sound. Not whispers this time, but a slow, deliberate scraping, like nails against bark. It came from the left, then from behind, then from the right. Surrounding them, Michelle's eyes darted wildly. What is it? Tim, what is it? He gripped her arm. Stay in the light. No matter what happens, stay in the light. The scraping gave way to something worse. A dragging sound, heavy as though something vast was moving through the underbrush. The fire flared suddenly, as if gasping in fear, and long shadows spilled outward across the clearing. The shadows moved when the fire did not. One stretched tall, its arms crooked at impossible angles. Another bent low, crawling across the ground, its fingers raking lines into the dirt. Dozens more followed, encircling the siblings, their shapes swaying with mockery of human form. Michelle clutched her blanket like a shield, tears streaking her cheeks. Tim, they're closer? They're closer than last night? The fire sputtered again. The air thickened. Then came the voices. Not the airy whispers from before, but bold, clear words spoken in unison. Stay, belong, with us. The ground trembled. The heartbeat of the forest pounded beneath their feet. The tent rippled. Shapes pressed against it, long hands, splayed fingers, faceless outlines pushing against the fabric as though trying to claw their way inside. The seams strained, the poles creaked, the canvas bowed inward. Michelle screamed. Tim seized a burning branch, waving it wildly at the encroaching dark. Stay away from us, have you hear me? Stay away. The shadows halted for a heartbeat, and then, impossibly, they laughed. A chorus of voices, shrill and guttural, high and low, echoing around the clearing. The sound wasn't merely heard, it was felt, vibrating through their bones, pressing into their chests. Michelle fell to her knees, clutching her ears, sobbing. Make it stop. Tim, please, make it stop. But the forest only mocked her. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter ended. The hands withdrew from the tent. The shadows pulled back, retreating into the trees. The scraping ceased. The night fell quiet again, almost too quiet, as if nothing at all had happened. Tim dropped the burning stick, his chest heaving, sweat chilling his skin. He pulled Michelle close, holding her as she shook, both staring wide-eyed into the darkness. They did not sleep. They couldn't. They sat awake until the pale light of dawn crept back into the clearing. When the sun rose, it revealed something new. Around their tent, etched deeply into the earth, was a perfect circle. Within it, spirals and crude figures with outstretched arms identical to the patterns they had glimpsed before. Only this time, they weren't scattered leaves. They were carved into the soil itself, burned black at the edges. Tim and Michelle knew now with certainty. The forest was not only alive. It had claimed them, and it was not letting them go. The fifth day rose beneath a sky the color of iron. There was no morning chorus of birds, no hum of insects. The forest stood in oppressive silence, the kind that pressed against the skin and forced every breath to feel shallow. Tim hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his body trembling from exhaustion. But his grip on Michelle's shoulder was firm as he shook her awake. "Michelle," he whispered hoarsely, "we can't stay here another night. We leave today." Michelle sat up slowly, as if her bones were weighed double. Her face was drawn, her lips cracked, her hair matted with dirt. She didn't argue, didn't mock him like she once would have. She only nodded, her eyes darting to the blackened circle still etched into the ground around their tent. They packed what little remained, their food was gone. The spare flashlight is gone. The compass still missing. Tim tightened the straps of his bag, his movements jerky, rushed. The air was wrong again, too still, too heavy, like the forest itself was listening. By mid-morning, they began walking. Each step felt watched. The trees were closer than they remembered, their trunks crowding in at unnatural angles. Roots twisted upward from the soil like skeletal hands, forcing them to climb and stumble as though the land itself didn't want them to leave. "Tim," Michelle murmured after nearly an hour of trudging, "we've been this way before." He clenched his jaw. She was right. The hollow stump with its gaping mouth of rot, the jagged rock shaped like a crooked tooth. They had passed it already, more than once. "It's turning us around," Michelle whispered, her voice breaking. "It won't let us out." Tim refused to answer. He grabbed her hand instead, tugging her forward, faster, as if speed could defeat whatever force guided the woods. His breath came ragged. Every shadow between branches seemed to lean after them. By afternoon, the silence broke. Not with birdsong, not with wind, but with footsteps. Crisp, deliberate, mirroring theirs. When they stopped, the steps stopped. When they walked, the steps followed, always a beat behind. Michelle's grip tightened painfully on his arm. "It's right behind us." Tim turned once, quickly, nothing but trees, stretching endlessly. He turned back forward and his stomach dropped. The path ahead had changed. A tree stood where none had been, its bark split open like a wound. From the gash in its trunk dangled something familiar, something red. Michelle gasped. It was her scarf, the one she'd stuffed in her bag that morning. Now it dripped with something dark, almost black, soaking into the ground. She covered her mouth, choking back a scream. Tim yanked her away, pulling her into a frantic run. Branches whipped their faces, roots clawed at their ankles, but they didn't stop. The forest shifted with each stride, paths curving impossibly, leading them always back to the clearing, always back to the circle etched in the dirt. When they burst through the brush at last, panting, their fire pit greeted them like a cruel joke. The tent, the blackened symbols, the scattered ashes of last night, all waiting. Michelle collapsed to her knees. "We never left," she sobbed. "We never left Tim." Daylight faded quickly, too quickly. Dusk fell like a curtain being pulled. The forest wanted them here for the night. Tim, age 40, forced the fire to life again, his hands shaking, splinters embedding in his palms. Michelle curled close, refusing to look at the dark. Night gathered, thick and suffocating, the woods stirred. At first, it was only the hum again, deep and low beneath the ground, the heartbeat of the earth itself. But then the voices returned, louder, stronger than ever before. Not whispers, not laughter. Something between a chant and a command, hundreds of voices overlapping, pressing in from every direction. Belong, belong, belong. The fire guttered as though starved of air. The shadows came next. Tall, spindly, twisting shapes that stretched into the clearing. They didn't linger at the edges this time. They stepped forward. Tim rose, brandishing another burning branch. His arm shook violently, but he shouted anyway, his voice breaking. "Stay back! We're not yours!" The shadows didn't halt. They circled, their crooked heads bending toward the siblings. Long fingers dragged through the dirt, tracing symbols around the fire. Michelle clutched her brother's sleeve, sobbing openly now. "It's the circle, Tim. They're finishing it." The ground trembled harder, the hum building into a roar that filled their skulls. Their fire cracked and spat, nearly extinguished by the vibration of the earth. Then came the figures. From between the trees, they emerged. Not shadows this time, but solid shapes, too thin to be human, too tall to be natural. Their skin glistened like bark slick with sap. Their faces were hollow impressions, carved where eyes and mouths should be. And yet they stared, they smiled. Michelle screamed. Tim shoved her behind him, swinging the flaming branch desperately. The nearest figure recoiled, but only for a moment. Its grin widened, splitting impossibly, and it let out a sound, half growl, half song, that made Tim's knees buckle. The circle around them glowed faintly now, its spirals pulsing with the same orange light Tim, age 40, had seen crack the Earth nights before. The soil smoked, the air tasted of iron. Michelle clung to Tim, her voice a broken whisper. "It's not just watching anymore, it's calling us inside." The figures closed in, their bodies weaving like smoke, their arms outstretched. The chant grew deafening. Belong, belong, belong. The fire collapsed into sparks. The clearing lit only by the glow of the earth. And then, silence. Every figure froze. Every voice stopped. The hum beneath the ground ceased. The forest stood perfectly still. Tim and Michelle clutched one another, hearts hammering. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. And slowly the figures stepped back, the glow dimmed. The forest returned to shadow. It wasn't mercy, it wasn't retreat, it was patience. The woods had been decided. They would not take the siblings tonight. But they would.